Good morning, everyone. Good morning. We will now transition from our sacred space and liturgy to our sermon series. Something that it's very important to me that I hope is sort of dialogical and has some interaction. It's always a little bit hard in a church this spread out to do that. Today we'll make some attempts at it, but also for this year, following the sermon series, also on Wednesday evenings at 7:30, we'll have an hour for whoever wants to come online through Zoom. And you have to pre-register for that to get the link, which is in our e-blast. Then you will have a chance maybe to have a more back and forth and some personal and more detailed conversation about this. But I will let the morning service be our prayer. Before speaking, I always pray that God grant wisdom and peace and give us the chance in this Lenten season to grow closer to Him as individuals and as a church. For that is, of course, the purpose of all of this. So let me start in this way. I love Lent, as I tell you always, because it's that time of year which God sets aside so that we might continue our walk and to reflect and to become better servants of His as individuals and as a church. And, we tend to think that we are our regular embodied physical selves all the time, and then when we come to church, there's a little bit of spirituality about us. But of course, the Christian journey and our scriptures and our tradition tell us sort of the opposite, that we're foundationally and fundamentally of God, of the Spirit, and that we're sort of accidentally enfleshed and physical and mental and emotional. I always tell you one of my favorite quotes that we are not human beings that have a spiritual experience, but we're spiritual beings that have a human experience. And I think that that's something that Lent reminds us of, and this Lenten series is based on that assumption. It's based on the fact that maybe the deepest part of us in our center is the most significant. Even if it's hidden, our godliness is no less powerful. In fact, it's sort of like, I'll use this image, we're sort of like an iceberg, that the part of us that is visible is much less strong and less important than that massive part underneath. So culture, which is the topic of this sermon series, is just like that. You could make the same iceberg analogy, that most of it lies beneath the surface, and then there's only some part of it that you can see, but it has a very strong influence on our faith lives. And this series comes from our common experience in this church. We've been working with me you have at least been working for almost 14 or 15 years. And we've been thinking and praying and experimenting about what an Armenian church here at St. Hagop is supposed to be for God and for you and I. And we've done a lot of work on that. This series comes from that and continues that. It also comes from, I've been on Bishop Daniel's committee to implement his beautiful vision of our churches building the body of Christ, which is our fundamental mission statement and fact about who we are. He's come to speak with us on many occasions, and he set out this broad, beautiful vision that no one else can do as well as he has done. And this is an attempt, once you have that big, sprawling vision, to get into details with the people in this church whose are members and essential parts of that mission. And on this committee for the vision, we kept on struggling to think of, okay, are there programs? Are there strategies? Are there people? Are there events? How do you, in Bishop Daniel's words, get the church to really be the church, first and foremost, in addition to all of the other things that we do? And we came to the conclusion that that is a culture issue. It's a culture issue to grow and change our churches into the one that God has called us to be. Because as a lot of organizational change people they say this, that culture eats strategy for breakfast is something I think that Peter Drucker said, which means that if you have all the strategies and plans and programs and events, but you don't have a culture that encourages people in sometimes unspoken, inherited ways, then you won't get anywhere. So let's talk about this concept of culture and church culture. It's a little bit complex, but we're going to make it simple and use a definition that is, and then I'm going to ask you, so get ready for some examples of church culture at St. Hugope. But culture, you could say, is the attitudes and the customs and the practices by which the church or any organizational body for that matter functions. It's sort of the ethos of this church. It's the spoken and unspoken messages. And to really simplify it, you could say that culture is found behind the statement, "This is how we do things around here." Okay? So with that said, attitudes, customs, practices of St. Hugope, or the diocese, we can talk about too. What are some examples of attitudes, customs, practices of St. Hugope Church? Our ethos. This is how we do things around here. Would anyone like to be so bold as to offer an answer to that question? No right or no wrong. Go ahead, Chris. Thank you, Chris. So Chris said, and sorry we don't have a microphone, so I'll just repeat what he said. He said we've built a culture that when things need to get done in the church, people really step up to make it happen. I have noticed the same thing that people who have been in other churches have mentioned, that the core of our church is extremely dedicated to whatever needs to be done in this church, and that is the truth. I think that's part of our culture. Absolutely. Any other? Attitudes, customs, practices. There's lots of them. Carol. You felt that welcome as a family? Does anyone else agree that our church is welcoming, like welcoming to a family? Good, excellent. And we're going to talk about that more. I think you could say that about our church, that our church is welcoming and brings you into its family, for sure. Any more? So there's hundreds of these, and because we're in a church body, I will do the talking now to take us through this. We can focus on one thing, one aspect of our church, an important one that we're going to talk more about next week, but worship, let's say. The culture of St. Hugope as far as worship, and this applies to the diocese as well. So we worship in ancient Armenian, okay? Not the spoken language of our people. This worship is high and holy and sacred, but perhaps less approachable than the common language, for sure less approachable. We are relatively formal in worship. If you've come from another church, you'll see that, there's silence in the church. We do ritual greetings even when we greet people, not just, hey, how are you? We don't clap hands. We have a choir that's sort of professional and an altar as well. It's not just open season. People dress more formally in this church, generally. I think that's a cultural thing. We don't use modern instruments or worship, only traditional. Some people have mentioned that we're more penitential in our the tone, I would say, of the Baldarak. If you've been, for example, to a African-American church, you will see a major difference between the tone of worship, which is very celebratory, and our church worship, which is more penitential. Both Christian, both nice, different cultures. Another culture aspect of our church with worship. Only priests are to bless, to give communion, to lead worship, to give pastoral care. That's not the same in every church. Someone already mentioned, we try to warmly welcome newcomers by name. That's part of our tradition and sort of worship, sort of fellowship. But we can add to that, we are very welcoming, but we don't actively open the door and seek worshipers from our neighborhood to join us. That's also true. These are just a few examples of our worship, and we'll get into more, and there's millions of them. And notice, please, I tried to be careful when talking about culture in the beginning to not add analysis or judgment on any of these aspects, and I do that carefully and on purpose because we are a family, and there's lots of deeply held and emotional topics, and worship and language is certainly one of them, that we don't need to rush into the why and the right and wrong and the because. First, we stick with the facts, and we're just going to try to analyze this as objectively and scientifically as possible. We worship God in an ancient language is a fact. The history is complex. The effects of worshiping in Armenia are complex, and you'll get two different opinions on whether that helps one or hurts one in experiencing God for every Armenian that you ask, or every person. And the answer is it's a mix of both. And we'll get to this next week when we talk about worship. But the important part is that we want to have sort of a slow process when discussing values and identity and truth among such a diverse group as we are. But I do want to say that while we're not going to rush to judgments and try to be objective as possible, this doesn't mean we're not going to talk about controversial things. Things like the language of the liturgy, like the split between the diocese and the prelacy, like only men on the altar, like women wearing veils. All of these are difficult issues, and people have deeply felt convictions about them that aren't the same, but that doesn't mean you don't talk about them. I'm of the belief that it's precisely those things that need to be talked about. First, just because prayerfully we might find a solution for everyone if we talk about them, but at least so that people of differing, deeply held opinions, they feel respected and they feel heard. And I also want to just mention one of my prejudices and beliefs, and that is, I think some people think that with Holy Tradition, you can't even talk about it, otherwise you're doing something wrong. And I do not agree with that, and I think that if anything is sacred, it's sacred because God, who is alone sacred, made it that way, and God seems to never discourage us. In fact, he encourages us to come to him with all of our questions and our concerns. He's not afraid, and he's not diminished by that. Okay, so now let's get a little more specifically. What is culture? Let's take a case study, okay? Because I think this gets at, hopefully answers the question of why we're spending time doing this for 4 weeks. If it doesn't, you don't have to come back. Let's take an example of our culture and analyze it and its effect on us. Because like we said before, it takes looking deeply into something because culture is like an iceberg where the greatest part is often beneath the surface. Let's look at dues membership, okay? So part of our culture in many dioceses in the Armenian Church and of St. Hagop until recently is that we are a church which we're a dues-paid membership church, a dues membership church. This is an attitude, it's a custom, and it's a practice of our church, so it definitely fits our definition of culture. And like so many aspects of culture, it's sort of an inherited tradition that we just tend to take for granted. This is how we do things around here. But a few years ago, we started asking questions about dues membership. We talked back to our tradition, I like that phrase, and we came to realize that like all parts of our culture, this dues membership was developed, informed, and created over time by leaders of our churches, just as we create and develop and maintain the culture of St. Hagop in our diocese now. And some people felt that that was sort of being sacrilegious and breaking our tradition and bylaws. This is how we do things. Who do you guys think you are? But we just asked questions of our church culture. And we'll ask questions about it during this entire sermon series. It doesn't mean that we want to change everything. It just means we want to prayerfully examine whether every part of our culture is relatively helpful or unhelpful in becoming a better Christian of the Armenian Orthodox way. That's our one and only goal. And the opening quote from a book assigned to all of our clergy last year by Bishop Daniel is, I think, helpful here. I love this quote too. It says that tradition is not the worship of ashes, but the preservation of fire. Tradition is not the worship of ashes, but the preservation of fire. So is dues membership, or any aspect of what we do and what our culture is it worship of ashes, or is it preservation of the fire that is Christ, that is the Holy Spirit, that is the essence of our faith? Well, we found this about dues membership. It's not very old, it's not very Armenian, and it's definitely not biblical. I could expand on this, but it's out of scope for now, for this. So why do we do it? Even though it's not ancient, it's not Armenian, and it's definitely not Christian, because this is how we do things around here. And that's the power of culture, for better or worse. And we also found that it has been abandoned by most other churches, including our sister churches of the Orthodox variety. And this is an interesting aside. What helped us find this out? Because we're blessed in this church to have a lot of people who have been members and experienced other church cultures in addition to ours. Why is that such a great gift and a benefit? Because until you step out of your own culture, it's hard to even see what is great about it and what could use improving, right? And until you've been a guest in another person's house, you don't know much about your house. Until I went to Armenia when I was 21, I wasn't as knowledgeable an American, both valuing the things that I always taken for granted, as well as seeing some things that I would like to improve in this country. But you don't even know until you, like a fish that's in the water, you can't know until you're out of water that you're in it in the first place. So that's a great benefit. And we made some changes to dues membership, and you might say to yourself, okay, well, that's just like this administrative thing. It's about money, right or wrong. It's not that big a deal. But the big deal is for the reason that culture, like I said, isn't just on the surface. As a practice, it works powerfully beneath the surface on our values, and it shapes the people of each generation who comes along, right? So what does a culture of dues-paid membership, how does that shape the ethos and values of all the people who encounter it? What does it say without saying even a word? Well, it says the church is a membership club with annual dues. Okay? You pay in and you get benefits. It says you're a good church-going Christian simply if you pay your dues. Forget all that other stuff in the Gospels and words of Christ and words of our Balarak. It says your voting in an annual meeting is your highest right as a church member. It says that giving to church is not a deep part of who you are. It's just like another bill that you pay. And I think it says also that giving to church is an obligation, not a transformation. Okay? And you can think of all of the opposite things that stewardship tells you to all of those different things. And now you see the importance of culture, of how it shapes people. And I'm picking on dues membership here. I have no judgment on parishes who practice it because, of course, I and we led, shaped, and maintained that culture for many years here. And also, as we'll talk about in week number 4, though we may be ahead of the curve on a better culture of giving and stewardship in this church, I still think we have a ways to go, and we will talk more about that in week 4. But the point here is simply that a process of prayerful reflection on our culture, it reveals whether or not a part of our culture hinders or helps our mission for God and each other. And that's why I think it's important to spend the next 4 weeks on this, and I pray it will yield fruit in the coming years. All right, so the last part here is about what we will do in the next 4 weeks. Going forward, as we examine our culture to help reveal the church we're called to be, we're going to use 3 tools. And they're also, not by accident, important tools of Lent for each of us personally. They are prayer and participation and priorities. Let's start with prayer. Even though culture trumps everything when it comes to strategy and planning, God's plan, of course, trumps everything, period. If anything positive is to change in our church and us as individuals, it can only be by the power and grace of God by which we live, move, and have our being. This is how we differ from any sports team or a business which also has a culture. We may be an organization, accidentally, but essentially, we're a living organism. We're a living organism which is animated by God. And that's why that term members is so powerful too. We're members of the living organism breathed by God here at St. Hagope. So Lent is that special time of year when we focus and again turn to the will of God which animates this church and everything we do. But I also want to say that though prayer is our beginning, it's not the end for us. There's a key phrase, I'll throw out all my favorite life passages and phrases for you that I think Armenian Church, Orthodox Church, would basically agree with, but we never said it so concisely as Thomas Aquinas, the great medieval Catholic saint. He said that grace perfects nature. Grace perfects nature. You should keep that in your head. It's a useful one. It's about the relationship of God and us. And it means that although all good things come from God and ultimately everything is God, that's what grace is, we're perfected as humans by an open heart, open will, and our efforts for God. That's the nature part, right? So it means we should pray to God for everything in our lives and our church, but it's also up to us to cultivate the best conditions to invite his grace. You know, that's obvious in your personal life, works also in the church life. If you pray to God to be healthy and you eat terribly all the time, that's not going to work because grace builds on nature. You have to do your part, and then God perfects after that. So, prayer, and then work and openness and repentance and reflection. So prayer is the first one. Participation, this might be one of the most important and one of the ones that's most in need of improvement in the Armenian church generally, and perhaps ours as well. We need participation. The important thing about a cultural perspective on our church is that it exposes the lie that there's just one leader of the church, me, or just a group of leaders of the church, the parish council, let's say. It forces us to see that in all the important things, everyone in here is a spiritual leader of this church. Because church culture, Armenian Orthodox Christianity, is caught more than it's taught. Go ahead and try to preach every week, Father Hovnan. That's something and that's important. But in the end, the culture of Christianity is caught, meaning it's not just spoken, it's not just taught, but it's by the examples, and again, the tone, and the love, and the things that are inherited to us that are sort of caught just by experiencing the community and everyone in it. Again, you preach about Christ's love of everyone, including the sinner, and then one of us, or Father Hovnan himself, goes outside and someone comes in and Father Hovnan says, "Get out of here, you're not welcome." Obviously, the message is not caught, but the example, a crude example at that, but you get what I'm saying. And so, because we're all leaders and because we're doing this all together and we're all called and have a mission by God to be all we are to be as individuals and as members of this church that we've been blessed with, the more of us doing this together, the more we're going to get to where we're going. The culture is going to change, and we're going to become the church that we wish to become. And That's the importance behind the simple but hopefully powerful little 5-question survey I gave to you all. Can I put you on the spot? Do people actually take that survey? Yeah? Okay. All right. Very good. If you haven't, could I please ask you to do that? It's in a couple emails that you got. If you have no email, I also printed a couple on the parish council table. You can write in your answers, and I'll enter it into the survey. They're anonymous, by the way, so I don't know who wrote what. But what I'm going to do with those, besides engaging everyone here, and I hope a lot more people online too, because it's an online survey, besides engaging them in being aware of our church culture and to where we're going as our mission and goals, I'm actually going to use the answers. There's already 40 of them, which is a nice biblical number, 40 answers to the questions, and I'm actually going to bring those answers out each week when we discuss each one of these signs of a healthy culture, and therefore we'll use your words and your concerns and your examples so that, again, we're doing this together, the only way to together work on the culture of the church and ask God's blessing in moving it forward. And so do submit your answers, and we will continue on with that. So to finish up, on the survey, you'll see the 5 signs of healthy church culture, and I'll give you a paragraph of each one, explaining them. And let me just tell you what the 5 signs of healthy church culture are. Number 1, what we're aiming towards is what this is. We seek communion with God in worship. So the only reason to be in worship, you can be in worship for any reason and we won't throw you out, but the only reason, you heard it here first, is so you can be in communion with God. That's all it's for. It's not to sound good primarily. It's not to feel good. It's not to see your friends. It's not anything. It's actually, and this is unique. No, it's not unique, but it's a accent of the Orthodox churches that worship is not the priest just preaching. It's not just reading the Bible, as important as those two things are. You are supposed to be encountering God and learning from God in worship, okay? That's number 1, and we'll talk about that next week. Number 2, we practice hospitality and forgiveness. Another way we could say this, I was shown this as well, we could just say we practice the love of Christ and forgiveness, okay? So if you're in communion with God, and if God has made room for you, a sinner, and me, a sinner, then right along with that, we have to also practice hospitality for other people and communion and forgiveness with them, okay? So hospitality isn't just welcome. We'll get more to that on week 2, but it's something about making room in your heart and space in yourself, even if it causes you sacrifice for someone else and where they are and what they need. That's number 2. Number 3, we discern our calling to growth and ministry. This is a big one, and this gets into a part of our culture of which I am a part, and I'm trying my best to change the culture of that, and that is, it's great to have a spiritual leader who is very definitely set apart in certain ways, but also, as long as it doesn't take away the calling of each person in this church, discern God made you, He made you for a purpose, and the church's function, and one of its major functions, is to engage you in that purpose and to benefit from your skills and God-given gifts, as well as make space for that to grow and to serve others. So we all have a calling. We all have a calling and a beautiful relationship to develop with God that is unique and that we must follow. Number 4, we invest in the church and its ministries. That gets to what I was saying about stewardship, that once we grow in our calling, in our ministries, this is the place where you apply that. And together we realize the truth about life, that success is one thing, and then when you're done with that, you go for significance, and significance is most found here in serving God and others with the many gifts he has given to you. And then finally, we witness to the Armenian Orthodox way. This one is a good one, and one that is advanced and a little foreign to our church. The Armenian church is not for Armenians. It is and it isn't. It is for Armenians. That's where we start, but we don't end there. If any of this means anything, then we are to share what we know, what we've become, who we are, with other people. And that's being a witness to the Armenian Orthodox way. And that's a challenging one, that's a fun one, that's one that inspires me, and we'll get into number 5. So real quick, where did these goals come from? Well, from our scriptures, from our church tradition. They're really, if you read all of the literature on it, this is the goals of any church and any Christian. But they're also the priorities of the diocese, because they're condensed forms of Bishop Daniel's vision, and they challenge his challenge to our parishes to be single-minded in building up the body of Christ, which is our ultimate calling. And little disclaimer, because someone thought different about this, the diocese, neither the diocese nor the bishop created any of this, or the survey, or used any of these words. They're all mine, but they're inspired by that, and I think they're a great example of trying to implement this broader vision together on a parish level. At least that's what this seeks to be. And so, I'm done, basically, and I want to thank you greatly for listening to me for this long, for engaging, I hope, in this study, which I think will be one of the most applied, prayerful and applied Lenten sermon series that we've done so far. I pray that the Lord use it to bring you closer to Him through your faith walk and your Lenten journey, as well as to look at the culture of St. Hagop Armenian Church and to help it be all it is called to be. And so, again, Wednesday evening from 7:30 to 8:30, if anyone wants to join this conversation on a smaller level with more time for you to actually say some things, that is Wednesday, 7:30, 8:30. You have to pre-register through a link in your e-blast. If that confuses you, you can talk to me or Grace or someone who has, I don't want to be ageist. Anyway, I was going to say someone under 40. But anyway, just someone who may have some experience with Zoom, and we can get you on there.